All right. Last 2 weeks, we talked about Ananias and Barnabas. And those two people were really the kind of first two people that spoke to Paul when Paul was converted to Christianity. He was Saul, and actually for a while he was still considered Saul by some of the other Christians. Paul is now a leader in the church, and that's kind of where we're at now. So we've established him becoming a Christian. We've established Barnabas' role of welcoming him into the way or the Christianity, and then also introducing him to the Christians in Jerusalem who were afraid of him, rightfully so, because he was there imprisoning them and voting against them to be punished once they were on trial. So that's Ananias and Barnabas. And then this morning we're going to jump forward into probably the more famous relationship Paul had, and that was Paul and Timothy. Obviously, we got the books or letters to Timothy in the New Testament towards the back. That's the Timothy that Paul was writing to. So everyone probably knows about that relationship. Now, the title is, Do Christians Need to Mentor People? You don't find the word mentor in the Bible. So this is an idea based on biblical principles, though. So when we talk about do Christians need to mentor people, we're really talking about discipleship. But we're going to use the word mentor in this way. So you do not find it, but here's some examples for you. We have Elijah and Elisha, Moses and Joshua, Naomi to Ruth, Jethro to Moses, and then even in the more practical sense for the New Testament church was Jesus and the disciples. Because there were several times where Jesus had to mentor these people. I don't know if you guys remember when Jesus, or actually, I'm sorry, there was a man who brought his sick son to the disciples and asked them to drive out the demon that was causing the sickness. And when they tried, they couldn't. They failed in trying to drive out this demon. And so the dad, in all of his efforts to try to get this to happen, goes to Jesus and says, these are your disciples, and they have authority to do this, and they couldn't do it. And Jesus takes responsibility for this because those are the people he's mentoring. And he took the responsibility even though it wasn't his fault. And he basically says, you unbelieving generation, and he's correcting them for what they did wrong. But all throughout his time with the disciples, he was mentoring them. And then we're going to look at Acts 16, 1 through 5. I want to give you a few examples of a couple relationships that I've had throughout my life, and my family and friends here they know these stories, so it's nothing new to them. But we all have people in our life that have come alongside of us and either sought us out or we sought them out to get us to a different point in our life. So I'm going to give you a few examples and kind of share a story about this relationship, but there's many more. These are just 3 that I picked out, but family, I have mentors there, but other friends, this is just a few that I've picked out. The first one is in regards to ministry in general, was my youth pastor. And a lot of you who grew up in the church probably had the same story at some point, that your youth pastor played an important role. Maybe it was even a children's director or something, because really the most influential stage in someone's life is when they are young. And for me, that was when I was a teenager. And this is Corey. There's a chance some of you have seen his face or read something, because he is at North Woodbury. He's the lead pastor there. When I answered the call to preach or become a pastor, I was 16 years old. And Corey was kind of not in the same exact sense, but kind of like Barnabas, where he welcomed somebody into the faith and then he started to equip them. And after I answered the call to preach, they did not give me a whole lot of time until it was time for me to prepare my first sermon. I don't remember the time frame it was, but it was at church camp in the summer, and if I'm not mistaken, I think it was in the fall maybe that I began preparing my first sermon. But Corey was somebody that took me under his wing and helped me prepare my first sermon. He had invited me over to his house, sent me home with a ton of books, even though I didn't read all of them. But I had resources for it, and he helped me work through it. And I spent weeks preparing this message, and it only lasted like 5 minutes. my first sermon. But Corey equipped me. He equipped me to begin to be a leader, to preach, and I don't even think at this point preaching is my strong point as a pastor, but Corey spent the time to do that. And then later on in my story, he left to be a lead pastor when I was still in youth group, and then probably, I'd say 5 years later, something like that, I needed a pastor to go through marriage counseling with me, and at the same time, he said, you know what, I need somebody to lead our youth group at church, and I accepted that invite to lead their youth group at North Woodbury. And all the years that he equipped me to be a leader, to be a teacher in the church, he then empowered me later on to do that. He saw, all the time that we spent together when I was a teenager, and then I was a young adult. He saw that and empowered me and said to do it. I want to share a story, and Ashley, you might remember this. One of the missions trips that we took is local missions trips. By local, I guess it was in Kentucky. I think it was on the border of Kentucky and Tennessee. We went to an orphanage to go help out with different things they need help out at this boys and girls orphanage. I'm sorry, it's serious that we're doing this, but I'm already laughing because of what happened. But Corey was in some ways, your typical youth pastor, would do things that were probably goofy, ill-advised, and all of us boys stayed at the boys' orphanage, and then the girls stayed at the girls' orphanage. So one of the times we were eating dinner, they had a garden there, because that's one of the ways they help feed all the kids and the in-home parents at that point. And at this garden, they were growing some hot peppers, hot, like habaneros. I don't even know what else there were. I didn't try them. But somehow we convinced Corey to do it. Corey was our friend as well as our youth pastor. And that's important, I think, because sometimes we dismiss, you don't need to be their friend, you need to be their pastor, or you need to be their mentor, you need to be something separate than a friend. I think I disagree with that, and I think they're supposed to be meshed. And I think that's how Corey took this, and this is one of the things that we got to do together. And I remember he took this hot pepper, ate it, and immediately started vomiting. Like it was bad. And the orphanage didn't quite have a lot of food, but they did have a gallon of milk, and he began to drink it, and we had a great time watching this and doing this. But all those fun times that we had, and we had a lot of good ones, Corey was with me throughout those stages of equipping, empowering, my friend, but also a mentor for me in regards to ministry. So when I think of, even when I'm preparing sermons now, there are times where I think back, and I was thinking about those times that I was with Corey, preparing that first sermon, that it didn't have a whole lot of content, but it had a lot of preparation and quality time. I still think back to that even when I'm preparing sermons now of, someone sat down with me and showed me how to do this. So you guys are reaping from what Corey sowed into me. Then Dan Richter, and I've honored these people on on Facebook. For whatever that counts, it's Facebook official that I did honor them. But Dan Richter was another guy, kind of the same topic. Dan Richter was the youth pastor at North Woodbury several years before I got there. Never met him, but when we felt God calling us to a church closer to home, because we live here in Mansfield, we were looking for a church, and we went to several. We ended up at some in Ganges area. We ended up at a couple in Mansfield. But Dan Richter sought Cassie and I out because he had heard through some of his friends at North Woodbury that Cassie and I were looking for a church to serve in that was closer to our home. We didn't really have a whole lot of a checklist of things that needed to be required at this church. And at the time, that church was non-denominational. But he reached out to us, had dinner with us, he and his wife, and empowered me into my first pastor position and even into the bivocational and then full-time. He equipped me as well. So again, when I'm thinking right now of being a full-time pastor, this is someone that comes to mind of how I got to this point. And there's something I saw in Dan that I wanted to really take from his experience and even his example. And I'll say this, that there are some pastors, maybe a lot of pastors, that fail in this area, is that they don't put their family first. They get so wrapped up in ministry, which is good, it's a good thing, but they get so wrapped up in ministry that they fail at home. And that's something Dan didn't do. And I latched onto that because I saw other pastors fail. I saw it in with personal people that I knew. Obviously, we see it. We even see it in people like our denomination's leaders, A.W. Tozer and Simpson, great men of God that taught and led. But truth be told, they failed in one area, and that was at home. So when I saw Dan was good at this, I said, I need to replicate that. I need to replicate that in my life as I seek to advance in the ministry. And I still hope to do that. And I think about it in times where life gets busy, and it seems like every night there's something to have a phone call or meet with somebody. I try to keep that a priority, and it's because of Dan setting that example for me. And then last one, I'll keep this one short. But this is my buddy Pete. Actually, this is my dad's friend. That picture is actually me on a dirt bike. It's hard to see. This was before nice cameras. I don't even know what this was taken on. This might have been a digital camera. I'm not sure. If I had to guess, this is probably 03, 04. I think it's 03. It's a long time ago. That's Pete standing beside the track. Pete has since passed away. I actually had the privilege to do his funeral. But I want to tell you something about Pete. My very first dirt bike race, and you guys have already heard I love racing dirt bikes. My very first one, I think I was 13, maybe 12. We drove about an hour and a half away. I can't remember how far Malvern was. And it started raining on the way there. And it got so muddy that I went out for practice, and I was like, I'm not racing. Like this, I'm way too scared. I don't know what's going to happen. I felt like I was in danger racing in this mud. But I got back to the truck after riding practice, doing terrible, and then I saw Pete. Pete was not a small guy. Pete was a big guy. Pete was like, 6'2", 300-some pounds probably at the time. Pete went out there on his dirt bike and just did lap after lap after lap in this mud that I could barely even get through. And I remember thinking, sitting in the truck as it's downpour, and we got the windshield wipers on, and I could see Pete on the track. I'm like, man, I wish I could ride like that. So I remember going home, and we got home, and I started riding in the mud that day. But it was the idea of I saw somebody do something that I wanted to do, and I wanted to replicate it. But I needed to put the practice in. And then later on, there was times where Pete would drop things off to Dad and say, hey, give this to Bub. If you don't know, my family and close friends call me Bub. But Pete cheered me on. That photo that you see right there is he's in between his own races, but he stood by the track and to cheer me on. And I wanted to replicate his riding ability when I first saw him ride. All right, enough about me. Today's the 4th of July, and I wanted to wear Stars and Stripes, the pants. You guys might have saw that on Facebook. I don't have them on. I'm sorry. But I was like, man, my first July 4th as a pastor is on a Sunday. That is special to me. I want you guys to know that I'm honored to be here today, especially because there's not always freedom to do what we do this morning and honoring those who fought for the freedoms that we have. Even churches here locally, there's not always the freedom to do that. And I don't want to take this lightly, but when I was thinking of some movies, who's some good movie mentors? You guys probably remember some of these. Do you guys remember the Benny the Jet and Smalls? Does anybody have any clue what I'm talking about? I see a couple of heads. Okay. Benny the Jet taught Smalls about baseball. You guys remember the saying, "You're killing me, Smalls"? Oh, okay, now you get it. So there's a mentor there. Benny the Jet taught Smalls about baseball. Does anybody remember The Matrix? Morpheus taught Neo about The Matrix. And then, I can't remember the name of this movie, but Whoopi Goldberg was in a movie with the nuns. What's that? Sister Act, yeah. So Sister Mary Clarence taught the nuns about Motown music. There are certain qualities for a movie mentor, and I was trying to find one that was maybe relevant somewhat. And after my conversation with Irv this weekend, I think there's a possibility that this movie was based off of Irv's life. Maybe the character is based off of Irv, I'm not sure. But do you guys remember Rambo in... Okay, Yeah. So Troutman, he mentored Rambo in Rambo 1, and then did you know that he's the only character that's duplicated in Rambo 2? I don't know if you knew that, or if it's even important, you might not care. But because he was his mentor in Rambo 1 and 2, in Rambo 3, Rambo's mentor was captured. Rambo was the one that was sent to save him. And we saw a shift in someone who was above him in rank at first, and then by the movie 3, he was captured, and Rambo was the one that came in and saved him. And I want to give you this quote, and this is Rambo. I think this was from Rambo, I can't remember if it was 2 or 3, but Troutman says, "What's wrong?" And Rambo says this, and I thought this was appropriate for this morning. "I wish the country loved its soldiers as much as the soldiers loved the country." And this is obviously, Rambo was based on the Vietnam War, so we can all understand where that sentiment comes from. I don't always like the government. I don't always trust the government. But I do appreciate the soldiers that have fought for us. And obviously, it's just a movie, but I think it's appropriate that we appreciate the steps that they've taken. So this morning's message is, should Christians mentor people? Let's go to Acts 16, 1 through 5. Maybe you can read it on there. If not, I'm going to read it anyway. And this section is called Paul Selects Timothy. I'm going to read the first 5 verses, and then we're going to pray. But it says, Paul went on to Derbe and Lystra, where there was a disciple named Timothy. Now Timothy was the son of a believing Jewish woman, but his father was Greek. The brothers and sisters at Lystra and Iconium spoke highly of him, and Paul wanted Timothy to go with him. So he took him and circumcised him because of the Jews who were in those places, since they all knew that his father was a Greek. And as they traveled through the towns, they delivered decisions reached by the apostles and elders at Jerusalem for the people to observe. And then in verse 5 is kind of the result of this. The churches were strengthened in faith and grew daily in numbers. If you would pray with me before we get into this morning's message. God, I thank you for your word. I thank you for the examples we've seen already in Ananias and welcoming Paul into the faith, and then even Paul and Barnabas and the relationship they had and the conflict that they went through. But even though there was conflict, there was still respect and in a possibility of even forgiveness and later on in their ministry, even honoring each other. And I pray that this morning you would give us wisdom in how to apply this to our lives. And God, I believe that this model is the model you've given to grow the church, to advance the kingdom. So I pray that you would give us the wisdom and knowledge on how to apply this so that we can do greater damage against the gates of hell for your kingdom. I believe we're supposed to be in the offense, not defense. I believe we're supposed to be in the fight. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. So in this passage, we see that Timothy, I'll leave this up here for a second. Timothy was half Jew and half Greek. There's a chance that his mom, even though she was Jewish, and Paul was going to speak to Jews after this, that she wasn't like a very practicing Jew. Like we might say if someone's a Christian but they don't attend church and maybe they live a lifestyle that they shouldn't, that they say they're a Christian but we're not quite sure. Well, Timothy's mom was probably in that category because partially because she was married to a Greek, and then also because Timothy wasn't circumcised, which was a Jewish practice. But Paul saw something in Timothy with those characteristics, and I think what he saw was imperfection, and the church was strengthened because of this. So my first point, and I don't know if you've noticed already, but a lot of times the beginning of my message is a lot of stories, examples, trying to give you a context of where we're going. We've got 3 points this morning, and we'll try to get through them in a timely manner, but I do believe God has something to teach us through this. So we should seek out others to mentor. So Timothy, again, he was half Jew, half Greek, and uncircumcised. And Paul saw something in Timothy which was imperfection. So I want to read this part here for you. I'm sorry, right before that. Yes, so Paul wanted Timothy to go with him, and he took him and circumcised him. That's a pretty big commitment on Timothy's part, to put it lightly. Timothy was probably converted back when Paul and Barnabas went through their first missions journey. And then Timothy, again, he wasn't born into the faith. He wasn't raised necessarily in a practicing Jewish home. But Paul and Barnabas, with their preaching and their witness to them, he was converted on their first journey. And when he came back, there was witness that since Timothy has been converted, he's been practicing, and there's witness to him of growing, and he might be a new leader in the church. And Paul saw that, and Paul wanted him. So I guess I want to say this to you, is that there's times where maybe we feel imperfect and that we don't need mentors, or that we can't mentor somebody. But that's not true. I think Paul actually sought out somebody with some imperfections. And then also when he took Timothy to these places, there was great witness of advancing of the kingdom. And many people came to Christ, and also the churches were strengthened because of it. Your life's value, and I want you to get this, because it's something that maybe you guys understand this and you're doing great in it, but I wonder if there's a chance that you don't understand this, is that your life's value is determined by how much of it you give away. So we think about all the things that we try to achieve. We think about the financial goals that we need to meet for our family, and that's a good thing. But sometimes we get so caught up in the goals and the achievements that we can have that we forgot to give away anything. And I'm not talking about just finances. I'm talking about your time and your experiences and those things that you've went through. Your life's value is determined by how much of it you give away. And you may think that you don't have a whole lot to give away, but I would argue that even in your imperfections, that is something of great value to give away. Paul says this. He says in 1 Corinthians, imitate me as I also imitate Christ. Christ is the most important part of this statement. And I appreciate you guys coming to church. I appreciate you listening to the message, and I appreciate that you guys are involved somewhat in your faith. And I wish I could have the boldness to say, and I do try to do this, but if you would try to imitate me, I do hope there's some positive things you see in my life and say, wow, I would like to replicate, whatever James does, but ultimately I'm going to fail. And I think you guys have seen time and time again that pastors fail. I've seen it in my own life, and then we see celebrity pastors where they fail, and then obviously the whole world knows about it. So I would say this. Imitate the things in me that you see that God is working in my life and that are positive things. But don't think that I'm Christ. I don't have any holes in my hands. I'm not perfect. But I'm trying my best to imitate Christ. So imitate the good things that I do, because it's only the Holy Spirit that it's empowered me to do it. But ultimately, Christ is the most important. And Christ is the one we long to be like. So in my life, there's been people who I've come in contact with, and I've seen the good in them, and I was like, I want to be more like them in that area. And maybe for you, there's things that you're struggling with right now, as far like, man, I'm broke, I don't have any money. You need to find somebody that's good at finances, and you need to learn that with them. Or maybe you're going through some marriage problems and thinking, I just don't know how to go through marriage and have a joyful marriage. You need to find somebody that does have a joyful and fruitful, godly marriage, and you need to learn from them. And then I could go on and on about what the topics are. It could be prayer. There's been times where I felt like I wasn't a good prayer warrior, and I still feel that a lot of times. But then I know people who really are. Like, man, that person, they pray, and things happen. And I want to be more like that. So whatever it is you think you're lacking in, I would do this. Imitate the good in people that you see, the Holy Spirit characteristics in people. Imitate them. Imitate the good in people that you've seen God work in their lives. but ultimately, Christ is your ultimate example, and that's who we're really trying to be like. We're not trying to be like other people. We need to be like Jesus. Let's go to a little bit further, or actually back in Acts. And this is setting us up for the next point here. When Luke was writing Acts, Luke was a doctor. So Luke wrote in ways that had meaning. It wasn't just... So like when you read John's writings, it's like a conversation. So when you read John, sometimes it's all over the place. It's like he's talking, and one minute he's talking about one thing, and then next there's another topic, and you're trying to bring this all together of what he's actually trying to say. Luke wasn't like that. Luke had purpose behind everything he did when he wrote, so it's a little bit easier to follow. Luke includes a lot more details in some of his writings. And I want you to take notice to this transition between Acts 12 and Acts 13. Acts 12:25 says, after they completed their relief mission, Barnabas and Saul. And that's important. The order, Barnabas first, and then Saul, it's not Paul yet, returned to Jerusalem, taking along John, who was called Mark. And we know the story between Paul and Barnabas and Mark and the disagreement they had. Now, once they were on the missionary journeys, here's what we see here, and this is Acts 13:42-43. As they were leaving, the people urged them to speak about these matters. The following Sabbath, after the synagogue had been dismissed, many of the Jews and devout converts to Judaism followed Paul and Barnabas, who were speaking with them and urging them to continue in the grace of God. Notice the name placement. Luke has a reason for that. Paul likely led the missions according to Luke and Acts, and I'm taking a little bit of liberty in saying this, but to my understanding, and I believe this is to be true, is that the reason Luke wrote it that way is because he was showing a leadership shift. So, in organizations that have a hierarchy of structure of who's in charge, what I think we have a potential of failing at, and this happens in the church as well, is are we more interested in our own leadership, whether it be by position or influence? Are we more worried about our leadership or leaving a legacy? Because leadership can be desirable. Like you like to have the power, you like to have the influence over matters. Legacy is a little bit different. When we think about influencing a movement, legacy says, I have leadership, but I'm going to pass it on to someone else. Because ultimately, the movement, whatever this is, and we can use the church as an example, and I believe Barnabas did this well, is that it needs to go on beyond us. If it just stayed with us, it just stayed within the church and in our current leadership structure, we would be stagnant and probably eventually die because of that. So what's more important, leadership or legacy? Sometimes we hold on too long to leadership and we don't empower and let other people lead. I will say that there's someone in our church who understands this. So Greg has been in leadership for a long time here. I don't know how many years Greg Friebel's been an elder, but it's been many, many years. And we've already had conversations of he's ready to pass on to the next generation. He understands that he could stay here and be a leader. He could stay here and keep a position, but he has already understood the importance of a legacy. In order for things to move on, there needs to be a new generation and a new people coming into leadership. So what's more important, leadership or legacy? Do you just desire to be in power, or do you want to use your leadership to move an organization or a movement, which is the church? What's more important to you? All right. So that brings us to here. We should seek out mentors. And this comes from 1 Timothy 1:18. Actually, I've got it on the next slide. We'll get there. We should all seek out our own mentors. Because truth be told, we're all lacking. And I believe that the church is a body. And if we believe the church is the body, and that means we are lacking something that somebody else has. That means, if we think of it in terms of a body, that somebody might have an arm that we don't have, or something like that. But you all have something to give. You guys all have something to give to someone else in this church. I don't have the brain power to figure all that out right now and give examples within the church. But you guys can probably already think of some people who have a personality trait that you don't have, and hey, we need to get that person because they have that personality trait over here so they can use what God's given them. You guys all have something that somebody else needs, and there's also something you need from everybody else within the church. So maybe it is things like a good marriage. Maybe it's things like somebody who has financial peace and out of debt and doing well with their finances. Maybe you're struggling in that area and you need to find somebody who has that. Or maybe you're that person. Maybe you're that person that says, you know what, I feel like God has given me the gift of prayer, that I am in tune with the Spirit, and I want to teach other people how to pray that way. Maybe you're that person that has something that other people need. Just to give you a couple examples in my life, that one has to do with my work, and if you don't know, I come from the auto industry, I guess you would call it, from service departments, working on cars, to collision work, that kind of stuff. When I was young adult, I was looking to transition out of working on cars because I thought I wanted to work on cars because my dad did. I thought it was cool. I'd be a mechanic and do that kind of stuff. And 2 years in, working on Hondas, I figured I couldn't make any money because I wasn't that great at it, and it was hard to do warranty work. So I went to my boss and said, is there anything else I can do? Because this just isn't working out. I'm not as good of a mechanic that I thought I could be, and I just don't enjoy it all the time. And they ended up putting me in a customer position. I was dealing with customers, giving them estimates, that kind of stuff. But there was somebody who was also working there that was a friend of mine, and I sought him out to say, hey, I need help. I need to learn how to do this. I want to be more like you because you're doing it well. Customers like you. You're making a lot of money. I want to do that. Like, I want to be good at my job. You're doing really good at it. And I sought him out. And maybe you guys have people at work as well, because I know some of you are in leadership positions. Maybe you're a boss. Maybe you're a manager. There might be people that you need to seek out and be a mentor to, not just to teach them the ins and outs of how to do the job, but actually come alongside them and encourage them and be somebody that's going to get them to the next level. I put a post on Facebook this past week of, have you ever really invested in someone and didn't want anything out of it? Have you actually just tried to be involved in somebody's life just to make it better for them? Just to call them and say, hey, can I bring a meal over this week? I know you guys are busy. Just want to help you out. Just going to bring a meal over. That's just one example, but have you ever really been involved in somebody's life just to make it better for them? That's it. And that guy for me at Mansfield Motor Group, or Whitey's, his name was Jason. And I remember some of the things he would tell me, and I don't know if he was prophesying on his destination, but he always said this. Anytime I had a problem, he'd say, James, I'm not always going to be here. You need to figure this out. And that, I felt like that was the heart of a mentor, though. Somebody who didn't care that they had a leadership role. They just saw somebody who needed help and wanted to get me to the next level, that I didn't actually need him anymore to get where I needed to be. And I think that's actually kind of the role of ministry when we think of mentoring, discipling, whatever you want to call it, is that we do come alongside someone and we mentor them, but our goal is not to always be their leader. Our goal is not to always be their mentor. We want to duplicate that. I guess you could call it this like a pyramid scheme. We need that person that we're mentoring to then become a mentor to other people, and then we can just coach them. We can just coach them along as they are trying to mentor more people as well. That's legacy. Leadership is when you need people constantly asking you for information and help. But Jason, in that statement, has always stuck with me is, James, I'm not always going to be here. You need to understand this. And that should be our thought as well, as when we're thinking about our children, when we're thinking about people that are friends that need help, is that we're not always going to be here. We need to prepare them for our absence. And then also somebody who mentored me was, his name was Pat Hewlett. And Pat was a very timely person in my life. Because once I left the Free Will Baptist College and moved home, I started attending the Mansfield Bible College, and I was confused on a lot of theology. And I don't claim to have it all figured out just yet either. But Pat took time with me to kind of lead me through without judgment. Pat was probably on a totally different side of theology than I was. But he kind of walked me through and questioned me and said, why do you believe that? Why do you believe this? And I truly think he got me closer to what I should have been believing in the first place. But I never ended up where he was. He just guided me through that process. We should seek out mentors. I believe we see that in 1 Timothy. And this is going to be our scripture here. It says, Timothy, my son. And this is, I think, how church should be. He says, I'm giving you this instruction in keeping with the prophecies previously made about you, so that by recalling them, you may fight the good fight. Paul is prepping Timothy to fight the good fight when Paul's not in his presence. And he says, my son, Timothy, my son. I love this. And even in my interviews to be pastor here, I told him I believe a church should be like a family. And I wasn't necessarily thinking of this verse, but I think this gives some credit to that, is that we all have spiritual parents as well. And I'm not just saying like, oh, this is my spiritual mom or dad, and that's it. What I mean is that it's kind of that relationship of the way a parent does raise a child. And that's how we should be. I think there's even an argument, and I'm not saying this is how our church should do it, but sometimes we think of children's wing and youth ministry as something separate from adults. But I think the most fruitful and effective way of looking at children or those young in the faith is that they should be like family. It should be like us raising them up, and the older generation taking the younger generation under their wing and guiding them in the way they should go. So we all should probably have spiritual parents who led us, and it could be the same age. I'm not saying that they're older like this. Everyone that's our spiritual parent should be 20 years older. That's not what I'm saying. It's just that somebody took you and spiritually raised you like a child. If you guys were here Friday, I think you saw witness to some of that, what that should be like. So Friday, Matt organized and put together a Friday night fire. Some could look at that and say that's wasteful. That's not good use of church grounds and church time because you're not having a Bible study or you're not having a worship service. I would argue that's probably not the case, because what do families do? They spend time together. Families get to know each other. Families eat together. They play games together. And through that bond, it becomes something like this. It becomes something like Timothy, my son. So I think things like that are important. Just like when you do youth group, it's not just always Bible study. It's games. And while games can sometimes be silly and goofy, they're important because you're building relationships. And relationships are important. And that's why I believe the church should be like a family. And that's our last point, is relationships should be like family. You should be walking with so closely with the people in this building. And I realize over the past year it's been difficult. It's been difficult because of different mandates and rules of who we can get together with, or not just rules, but even feeling safe if we should go outside, if we should be with groups of people. I realize it's been difficult for the past year and a half. But what I'm saying is that the people that you're sitting with right now in this room, I would think it would be ideal if when we walk in here on Sunday mornings, it feels like, oh, there's my brother, there's my sister, oh, there's my church mom, there's my church dads, there's my grandparents. That's what it should feel like. And to be honest with you, when I was growing up, I think I experienced that to some point, because I didn't go attend youth group. I would go to men's Bible studies, and the older guys that were probably in their 60s and 70s when I was a teenager, they just took me under their wing. They would feed me, they'd teach me, joke around with me. It was like they were my grandparents at church. And I think relationships should be like family, and I think you should be walking so closely with the people in this room and people outside of this room. I realize not everybody's here, is that it should feel like a family. So we are all Paul's and we're all Timothy's. And this goes back to the point of we all need something from other people. I'm not just talking about using people, but there's something somebody else has that you need. And that's like a Timothy. And then sometimes you're a Paul as well. Sometimes there's things that you've experienced, things that you've went through, or maybe things you've gotten really good at, but somebody else needs. We're all in both these categories. And I think it's helpful for us to be honest with ourselves and know that. So here's our challenge this morning. And I want you to go out with this question in your mind. Will we seek out people to mentor us and for us to mentor? I think if we don't do that, the church will just dwindle away, because the structure of the New Testament church was one of discipleship. Go and make disciples is the last thing Jesus said to them. Go and make disciples. That's our great commission. Now, I use the word mentor, but it's just to mentor them in the faith, which by definition could be said discipleship. But I think it's a little bit easier for our minds to understand when we use this word. So will we seek out people to mentor us and for us to mentor? I want to give you one last illustration and we're done. You guys all know that the lion is the king of the jungle. But why is the lion still the king of the jungle? And I've heard this illustration. It's not my experience, but a pastor went on a missions trip to Africa, or I think it was Africa, wherever the lions were. So he took a trip and they did a tour of where the lions were. And when they parked the vehicle they're in, they got to watch. And I don't know if you know this, but the female lions are the ones that actually do the hunting. The men the male lions, they just get to eat. So the women are doing all the work, it seems like, in this. So what he saw was there was kind of a bush and bulls that were the prey for the lions. And he saw the mom lion take her cubs and grab them by the neck and put them under a tree that's kind of on a hill. And it just seemed like the mom was just getting them out of the way during the hunt. But what he saw, he said, changed his mindset on what it looked like to discipleship in the church and how to keep the church growing and the movement of Christianity growing is when he saw the mom drop them off at a higher spot under a tree in safety, and then her and the other female lions went on the hunt. And as they're hunting and they're getting ready to get their prey, what he saw was that it wasn't just that the cubs were under the tree in the shade to sleep or nap. He said they were sitting there and at full attention, watching exactly what their mom was doing. They were watching their mom do the job that they were eventually going to have to do. And the mom understood mentorship, so that when the mom's dead and gone, the next pride comes through and is able to do what they need to do, which is why the lions are still the king of the jungle. They don't have a generation kind of like humans where we have that generational cycle of strong people to create good times. I can't remember, but you guys know it. Strong people, good times create weak people create bad times create strong people. Is that how it goes? You guys can look it up later. So, yeah, there's a cycle. The lions don't have that. So as humans, we go through cycles of good times, bad times, and we're always going in this cycle. And I think the church has a possibility of doing that as well. But if we have the mindset of discipleship, of mentoring more people, and then getting them to mentor more people, that's the setup that God created for us in the New Testament. If we do that correctly, I think that maybe we could have something to learn from those lions and the king of the jungle, is that those who are coming behind us will be equipped and empowered to do ministry and to not just do ministry like using that word, but creating more disciples. Like that's what we're supposed to be doing, creating more disciples. So that is my challenge for you. Will you seek out people to mentor and for us to mentor? Or for you got it. For us to mentor people and people to mentor us. I think I wrote this out funny. Anyway, that's my challenge to you. Take it and understand that this is what God has called us to do. He's called us to go and make disciples. And I think Paul, taking Timothy, who was an imperfect example of what a Jew should be, being that he came from a household of a mom that probably wasn't a very practicing Jew and a dad that was a Greek, and he was uncircumcised. He took him and brought him into the faith, and the church was strengthened. And that's how it works here as well. So if you would, pray with me, and we'll be closed. God, I thank you for this example of Paul and Timothy. I thank you even for the people in my life that had nothing to benefit from, but they invested in me, they poured into me, and God, I want to honor their efforts that they've put into this. I hope that they see that their efforts have had fruits within the church and within this world. I pray that you help us do the same with the people we're in contact with, whether it be coworkers, friends, family. I truly believe, God, that you've given us this message so that the church can be strengthened, because we know that it's struggled for a while. So help us take this example, help give us the wisdom and knowledge to use it, and I pray that you would be glorified in our efforts. I pray this in Jesus' name, amen.